The first hard frost came to the Arizona high country in late November of 1889, settling over the town of Silver Creek with a cold that surprised residents accustomed to milder winters at lower elevations. Jasper Reed stood outside the church social that Sunday afternoon, 6 years old and small for his age, watching the other children play while his father Amos spoke with a neighbor about work that hadn't materialized in weeks. Jasper had lost his mother Ruth to a fever the previous spring, and in the 6 months since, he had watched his father grow thinner and more exhausted with each passing week, taking whatever labor the mining town offered while trying, not always successfully, to keep his son fed and warm. When Jasper approached Winifred Sterling that afternoon, the wealthiest widow in 3 counties, standing near the church steps in a coat of deep burgundy wool, he did not ask her for food or shelter or work for his father. He asked her something else entirely, something that would leave half of Silver Creek in tears before the afternoon properly ended, and something that Winifred herself would spend the rest of her life remembering as the moment everything genuinely changed. Amos Reed had once worked as a skilled blacksmith in Silver Creek, steady, respected work until the town's largest mining operation closed its smaller satellite claim 8 months earlier, taking with it nearly half his usual business from miners who no longer needed their equipment properly maintained. Ruth's death that same spring had compounded the loss considerably, grief and reduced income together, leaving Amos struggling to maintain even the modest shop he still operated. He loved Jasper fiercely and worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide for him, rising before dawn to take whatever labor the town offered beyond his own dwindling shop business, often returning well after Jasper had already fallen asleep in the care of a kindly neighbor woman who watched him during the longest days. The particular loneliness of raising a child alone while grieving a wife had worn visibly on him over the preceding months, a weariness Jasper had noticed even if he lacked the words to properly name it, watching his father's shoulders grow more permanently bent with each passing week, his laugh, once frequent, becoming something Jasper had to work considerably harder to earn. Winifred Sterling had inherited the largest cattle and mining interests in the territory from her late husband Cornelius, a man 20 years her senior who had built considerable wealth before a sudden illness took him 3 years earlier, leaving her the sole steward of holdings that stretched across nearly the entire county. She was 39 years old, and she had spent those 3 years managing her extensive holdings with a competence that had earned her respect throughout the territory, learning cattle markets and mining contracts with the same careful diligence she had once applied to running Cornelius's household. The grand house she occupied alone had grown considerably quieter with each passing season, her own marriage having never produced children before Cornelius's death ended that possibility entirely. A private grief she carried quietly beneath her composed public presence, rarely speaking of it even to the few friends who might have offered genuine comfort had she allowed herself to ask for it. Jasper approached Winifred slowly, the way a child approaches something he has decided, for reasons entirely his own, to trust completely. "Ma'am," he said, tugging gently at the edge of her burgundy coat. Winifred looked down, startled from whatever private thoughts had occupied her attention, into a small, solemn face studying her with unusual seriousness. "Yes?" she said, crouching slightly to meet his eyes properly. Jasper considered his words carefully, the way children sometimes do when a question has weighed on them long enough to require exact phrasing. "Can you be my mama?" he asked, "just for winter. Papa's real tired, and I heard the ladies at the mercantile say, you're the kindest lady in the whole territory, and I thought maybe if you were my mama just till it gets warm again, Papa could rest some, and I wouldn't have to worry so much about him being sad all the time." Winifred went entirely still, the request landing with a weight that seemed to physically press against her chest. Several nearby churchgoers, close enough to overhear the small, earnest voice, had gone quiet themselves, and what Winifred said next left the gathering crowd, and eventually the whole town of Silver Creek moved to tears once word properly spread. "Oh, sweetheart," Winifred said, her voice catching despite her evident effort to keep it steady, kneeling fully now so she could look directly into Jasper's earnest face. "I can't be your mama just for winter, and then simply stop being her once spring arrives. That isn't how mothers work, not the real kind, not the kind your heart is clearly asking for." Jasper's face fell, small shoulders drooping with disappointment. He tried valiantly to hide. Winifred reached out and gently tilted his chin back up. "But I can promise you something else," she said. "If your papa is willing, and if it's something both of you genuinely want, I would be honored to try being your mama for considerably longer than just one winter. Not because you asked so sweetly, though you did, and not because I feel sorry for you, though my heart is rather thoroughly broken by what you've just told me, but because I find myself wanting exactly what you're describing nearly as much as you seem to want it yourself." By this point, Amos had noticed his son's absence and crossed the churchyard quickly, arriving just in time to hear Winifred's response, his own composure cracking visibly at the sight of his son's hopeful face and the wealthy widow kneeling before him in the cold churchyard grass. "Jasper, what have you said to Mrs. Sterling?" Amos asked, mortification plain in his voice as he took in the scene, several churchgoers now openly wiping their eyes at what they'd witnessed. Winifred rose to face him directly. "Your son asked me a question with more honesty than most adults manage in a lifetime, Mr. Reed," she said. "I'd like to speak with you properly, away from all these watchful eyes, about whether his request might genuinely be worth considering, not as charity, but as something both our families might actually need." Amos stared at her, disbelief and exhausted hope warring visibly across his weathered face. "Ma'am, I don't rightly know what to say," he admitted. "I never meant for Jasper to trouble a stranger with something so personal." Winifred's expression softened considerably. "He didn't trouble me, Mr. Reed," she said. "He offered me the most honest conversation I've had in 3 years of careful, guarded solitude. Perhaps we might discuss this somewhere more private than a churchyard full of witnesses, and you can decide for yourself whether anything I have to say holds genuine merit." They spoke that same afternoon at Winifred's own home, Jasper occupied with warm cider and a plate of cookies in the kitchen, while the adults talked properly in her study. "I'm not proposing anything improper, Mr. Reed," Winifred said plainly. "I own considerable property and precious little purpose for it beyond managing what my late husband built. I have a genuine need for someone who understands metalwork and equipment maintenance, work my mining operations require considerably more of than my current staff properly provides. I could offer you employment, fair wages, and a house on my property considerably more comfortable than whatever arrangement has your son worrying about your exhaustion. Whatever grows between our families beyond that arrangement, I won't presume to predict or pressure. But I find I cannot simply walk away from a child brave enough to ask a stranger for exactly what his heart needed and pretend I never heard the question at all." Amos studied her for a long moment, pride and desperate practicality waging visible war across his tired features. "I don't take positions I haven't earned, ma'am," he said. "And I won't have this town saying I traded my son's comfort for a rich widow's charity." Winifred held his gaze steadily. "Then earn it," she said. "Come inspect my mining operations equipment needs properly. Decide for yourself whether the work suits your genuine skills, not simply whether it suits your circumstances. I'm not offering charity, Mr. Reed. I'm offering fair employment for work I genuinely need done, and whatever else might grow from proximity and time, that remains entirely a separate question neither of us needs to answer today." Amos accepted the position 2 days later, after careful inspection confirmed the equipment maintenance work was genuine and considerable, precisely the kind of skilled labor his blacksmithing background suited perfectly. The cottage near Winifred's main house, when Amos and Jasper moved into it that week, sat considerably closer to comfortable than the small rented room they'd occupied since Ruth's death, a proper hearth, sound walls, more space than either had known in months. Jasper claimed the smaller bedroom with quiet delight, running his small hand along the real glass window pane as though he could scarcely believe such comfort belonged to him now. And that first night, Amos sat beside his sleeping son a long while, still faintly disbelieving of how completely their circumstances had shifted since a churchyard conversation he'd never anticipated his son initiating. By the second morning, Jasper had already claimed a particular spot on the cottage porch as his own, declaring with great seriousness that he intended to watch for Winifred's approach each evening from exactly that vantage point. He threw himself into the equipment maintenance work with the same careful skill that had once made his Silver Creek shop respected, and within a month, machinery that had suffered years of inadequate upkeep began running considerably more reliably, saving Winifred's operation real money through repairs no previous hand had properly managed. His pride flared once in mid-November when Winifred arranged for new tools to be delivered to his workshop without first consulting him, a gesture she'd intended as simple practicality, but which Amos initially received as unwelcome charity dressed up as employment necessity. "I can make do with what I have, Mrs. Sterling," he said, more sharply than he'd intended, when she rode down to see the matter properly settled. She studied him a long moment before responding, her own composure steady despite his tone. "I don't doubt that you can," she said, "but proper tools mean faster, safer repairs, and I'd rather not watch you injure yourself proving a point about pride that neither of us particularly needs proven. Accept the tools, Mr. Reed. Consider it simple business sense rather than charity, because that's genuinely all it is." Amos stood there a long moment, feeling the sting of his own overcorrected pride, before finally nodding once, gruffly, and thanking her properly. Winifred found herself visiting the cottage most evenings, first under the excuse of reviewing the mining operation's improving equipment logs, though the truth ran considerably deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Jasper small gifts, a set of wooden building blocks, a warm knitted scarf, and sat with him by the hearth while Amos finished his evening work, discovering in herself a warmth toward the boy that startled her after 3 childless years of careful, guarded solitude. She began teaching Jasper his letters on quiet afternoons and found herself laughing at his stubborn insistence on certain unconventional spellings simply because he preferred how they looked written out. One evening she found a small carved wooden horse resting on the cottage porch rail, no note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife, and she knew exactly whose hands had made it, keeping it in her coat pocket for several days before finding the words to properly thank him. Word of the arrangement spread through Silver Creek exactly as Amos had privately feared it might, especially given how publicly Jasper's original question had already made their circumstances known throughout the town. Women at the mercantile whispered that the widow Sterling had let a child's innocent question maneuver her into an arrangement no grown adult would have proposed so quickly on their own judgment, that grief and loneliness had clearly overtaken her usually sound business sense. A few of the more pointed remarks suggested Amos himself had coached his son toward exactly the kind of appeal most likely to soften a wealthy widow's guard, an accusation that stung considerably worse than the gossip about charity ever had. Amos heard a version of this directly one afternoon at the mercantile counter, 2 women falling silent and exchanging a knowing look the moment he approached, and he left without purchasing what he'd come for, his jaw tight with a shame he'd thought himself long past feeling by that point in his life. It was Constance Bramwell, Otis's own wife and a woman who had known Winifred since girlhood, who finally spoke plainly against the whispers one Sunday after church. "I've watched Winifred Sterling grieve a husband and an entire unrealized family alone for 3 years, without a single one of you thinking to bring her so much as a kind word," Constance said, loud enough to carry across the churchyard. A 6-year-old boy had more courage asking for what he needed than this whole congregation has shown in 3 years of watching a good woman suffer in silence. I'd say shame belongs considerably more to the rest of us than to either the Reeds or Mrs. Sterling. Winifred heard the remaining whispers herself and let them slide past her like rain off an oiled coat, though she found herself, for the first time in years, genuinely grateful for a friend willing to speak so plainly on her behalf. Not every week passed smoothly. In early December, word reached Silver Creek that diphtheria had broken out among several mining families in the neighboring settlement of Copper Flat, spreading with alarming speed through the crowded boarding houses there before anyone properly understood the danger. Within a week, the illness had reached Silver Creek itself, several children falling seriously ill nearly simultaneously, and the town's single doctor, an overworked man named Dr. Halloway, found himself overwhelmed almost immediately by cases arriving faster than he could properly treat them, his small office quickly proving inadequate to the crisis unfolding around him. Winifred, drawing on both her resources and her position, organized the town's response with a determined efficiency that surprised even those who already respected her, converting a portion of her own property into an isolation facility for the sickest children, sending riders to Phoenix for additional medical supplies, and, when possible, an additional physician willing to help through the crisis, and personally helping coordinate care alongside the overwhelmed doctor, working alongside her own household staff to prepare beds, boil linens, and manage the constant flow of frightened families bringing their children for treatment. The disease reached the cottage itself in mid-December, Jasper waking one morning with the telltale sore throat and low fever that had already claimed several other children in town. Amos's composure shattered entirely at the sight, memories of Ruth's fatal illness clearly surging back with terrible immediacy. "Not him too," he said, his voice breaking as he held his son close. "I can't lose him too, Winifred. I don't know how I'd survive it." Winifred, despite her own mounting fear, kept her voice steady and practical, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered supplies. "We caught it early," she said. "That matters considerably more than panic does right now. Get him to the isolation house immediately. I'll ride for Dr. Holloway myself." Jasper's illness progressed rapidly over the following 2 days, his fever climbing despite every treatment the exhausted doctor attempted, his breathing growing increasingly labored as the disease's characteristic membrane began threatening his airway, a complication that had already proven fatal for 2 other Silver Creek children that same terrible week. Amos barely left his son's bedside through those first 2 days, and Winifred divided her attention between Jasper directly and the dozen other frightened children now under her property's care, though she found herself returning to the small boy's cot far more often than her own careful sense of fairness toward the other patients strictly required. Winifred barely left the isolation house through those 2 days, alternating between caring for Jasper directly and coordinating supplies for the dozen other sick children now under her property's care. "You should rest," Amos told her at one point, himself hollow-eyed with exhaustion and terror. "I promised him I'd try to be his mama," Winifred said simply. "I don't intend to break that promise now when it matters more than it ever has before." On the 3rd night, Jasper's breathing deteriorated sharply enough that the doctor performed an emergency procedure to clear his airway, a desperate measure that succeeded only after several agonizing minutes that felt, to both Amos and Winifred watching, like the longest of their entire lives. When Jasper's breathing finally eased and his fever began, at last, to break toward morning, Winifred sat holding his small hand through the remaining dark hours, unwilling to leave his side even for the sleep her own exhausted body desperately needed. We are more than halfway through Winifred and Amos's story now, and if a little boy's brave, honest question has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the Arizona frontier. What do you think Silver Creek will look like once this terrible outbreak finally passes? Tell us in the comments whether you believe Jasper will recover fully from such a frightening illness. Now, back to Silver Creek, where the entire town waited anxiously to learn which children would survive the outbreak's worst week. By the week's end, Jasper had turned a definitive corner, color returning to his small face, his breathing steady and unlabored for the first time in days, though Dr. Holloway cautioned that full recovery would still require considerable time and careful monitoring. Not every family in Silver Creek received such fortunate news. 3 children across the town succumbed to the outbreak before it finally ran its course in early January. A devastating toll that left the entire community grieving even as those whose children survived offered what comfort they could to families facing unimaginable loss. Winifred, drawing on both her wealth and her now evident genuine care for the town's welfare, quietly covered medical expenses for every affected family, regardless of their ability to pay, and organized a proper memorial service for the children lost, personally visiting each grieving household in the weeks that followed to ensure their families never felt alone in grief, the way she herself had once felt following Cornelius's death, sitting with mothers who had lost children and simply listening, without offering the kind of empty comfort that grief rarely finds genuinely helpful. The outbreak's aftermath transformed how Silver Creek regarded both Winifred and Amos entirely. Whatever gossip had circulated about a hasty employment arrangement or a child's engineered appeal dissolved completely against the visible reality of Winifred's tireless care through the crisis and Amos's own steady presence helping coordinate the isolation house's daily operations, despite his own terror for his son. Even Constance Bramwell, who had already spoken in the couple's defense before the outbreak began, found herself moved to tell her husband exactly what she'd witnessed during her own volunteer hours at the isolation house. Winifred, moving between sickbeds with an exhausted, unwavering devotion that no amount of prior gossip could survive, witnessing firsthand. Otis Bramwell himself, a weathered miner who had lost his own young nephew to the outbreak, despite everyone's best efforts, spoke for much of the town's shifted sentiment one evening at the mercantile counter, his grief still raw, but his gratitude toward Winifred's efforts entirely genuine despite his personal loss. "I watched that woman sit up 3 straight nights with children that weren't even her own blood," Otis said. "I watched Reed work himself past exhaustion, helping other families through the same terror gripping his own household. Whatever this town once whispered about charity or convenient timing, I'd say the last month settled that question rather more thoroughly than any gossip ever could." Jasper's recovery continued steadily through January, his strength returning gradually as the harsh winter began, at last showing early signs of eventual retreat. One evening, sitting by the cottage hearth with Jasper, finally strong enough to sit up properly, and Amos watching them both with an expression that had shifted considerably over the preceding weeks, Winifred found herself reflecting aloud on everything the terrible month had revealed. "I promised him I'd try to be his mama," she said quietly to Amos once Jasper had drifted to sleep against her shoulder. "I find I no longer think of that promise as trying at all. I think of it as something that's already entirely become true, regardless of what any formal arrangement between us might eventually determine." Amos was quiet a long moment, studying the two of them in the firelight. "Tell me honestly," he said, "did you ever, even briefly, resent him for asking what he asked that first day? It's an enormous thing to place on a stranger, even innocently." Winifred considered the question seriously. "Never resentment," she said. "Something closer to recognition, I think. As though he'd simply said aloud what I'd been too afraid to properly admit to myself for 3 years, that I wanted precisely what he was describing, a family, a purpose beyond managing Cornelius's holdings alone in an increasingly quiet house." She looked at him directly. "I've spent this entire month terrified of losing him, Amos, in a way that made every careful boundary I'd maintained since Cornelius's death feel suddenly, entirely irrelevant." Amos looked at her, at his son sleeping peacefully in her arms after nearly losing him entirely, and something in his own careful reserve finally gave way completely. "I've spent 8 months believing I was failing Jasper simply by grieving Ruth as thoroughly as I have," he said. "Watching you these past weeks, I've come to understand that grief and genuine love for someone new aren't actually opposites requiring me to choose between them." Winifred's eyes filled with tears she made no effort to hide. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we might stop treating this as a winter arrangement and start treating it as something considerably more permanent, if that's genuinely something you and Jasper both want." Amos crossed the small distance between them, careful not to disturb his sleeping son, and took Winifred's hand properly for the first time since their arrangement had begun. "I've wanted that for weeks now," he said quietly, "though I've been too cautious about the timing to properly say so." He leaned forward then and kissed her gently, careful and unhurried, despite everything the preceding weeks had put them both through. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or crisis-born gratitude. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of two people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier odd, found their way to standing together through the aftermath of a terrible winter, finally beginning to pass. Spring arrived slowly across the Arizona high country that year, wildflowers blooming first along the very creek that gave the town its name, and Winifred and Amos were married in a real ceremony that spring, the entire town of Silver Creek turning out not merely from curiosity, but from genuine affection earned through the hard winter they'd all survived together. Jasper, fully recovered and considerably stronger than he'd been even before the outbreak, stood proudly beside his father throughout the ceremony. And when the moment came for Winifred and Amos to exchange their vows, Jasper stepped forward unprompted and took Winifred's hand in his own small one. "You said you couldn't be my mama just for winter," he said, loud enough for the gathered town to hear clearly. "But winter's over now, and I still want you to be my mama forever this time, not just till it gets warm." Winifred knelt right there in her wedding dress, gathering Jasper into her arms as tears spilled freely down her face. The entire assembled town of Silver Creek similarly overcome, several grown men wiping their own eyes unashamedly at the sight of a promise made in a churchyard finally being properly fulfilled. Years later, travelers passing through Silver Creek still spoke of the Sterling household, though most had long since started calling it something simpler: the family that had weathered the worst outbreak the territory had ever seen and emerged from it stronger rather than broken. Otis Bramwell, grown grayer with each passing winter, still told newcomers the story of Jasper's churchyard question, always ending it the same way: that he had never seen a child's honest heart accomplish what months of careful adult courtship might never have managed on its own. Jasper himself, grown into a steady young man who had followed his father into skilled metalwork, liked to tell visitors that he remembered the exact moment he'd decided to ask his question that autumn afternoon, watching his father's tired face across the churchyard and simply deciding, with the uncomplicated clarity children sometimes possess, that someone needed to say plainly what the whole family had been too proud or too frightened to properly voice themselves. They no longer spoke of that first uncertain winter with anything but genuine tenderness. They spoke of something that had, against every hard lesson the frontier and that terrible outbreak had taught them, turned out right. Above the mantel in the main house, beside the small carved wooden horse worn smooth from years of handling, hung a simple framed record of every family the isolation house had helped through that difficult winter, a reminder of loss alongside genuine survival that Winifred insisted remain visible rather than forgotten. It started with a question no child should have needed to ask, Winifred liked to say to anyone who inquired about it. And it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people brave enough to ask for exactly what their hearts need, and the people wise enough to answer honestly rather than simply offering easy comfort. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive an Arizona winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts considerably longer than anyone initially dared hope. One honest promise, kept faithfully long after the season that first prompted it, has passed into fond and grateful memory. If Jasper, Amos, and Winifred's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most: the churchyard question, the outbreak's darkest days, or the wedding day promise finally made permanent. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes a child's honest heart can accomplish what careful adult caution sometimes cannot. In our next story, a widowed schoolteacher offers a grieving rancher one impossible winter bargain, and neither of them expects what it will cost to keep it. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West. And while it touches on grief, illness, and the fear of losing a child, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.